In this week's video, we talk about my thought process behind my 2017 Crystal Rush entry, Forgotten Paths. In this video, I want to discuss my process that I employ when I paint a miniature that I'm really straining on getting a good result with. I want to talk about the failures that I encounter, how I overcome the failures, some of the triumphs, and everything in between. I also want to apologize that all of the work in progress footage is all photos and not videos. I started painting this miniature roughly 4 months ago, and at that time I didn't really have a video setup that I was comfortable with using on something that I cared about the result so much. I was afraid that the video process would not only slow me down, but also make me paint in a subpar way. Now I have a video process that's much better, so for future videos, I'll be able to paint them with a video going, so you'll be able to see a much better idea of what I'm talking about. But for now, the How I Paint series is just photos, but in the future, it'll change. When I first got started, I kind of jumped right in. I like to be aggressive and kind of tackle my projects instead of kind of being afraid of them and tiptoeing around them. I like to just get right into it. So I assembled the whole miniature and I filled the gaps, primed her black, and broke out my scale 75 non-metallic metal gold set and kind of went to town. I wanted to paint the miniature with non-metallic metal gold because I wanted to practice that talent. My last couple of pieces have all employed non-metallic metal gold, and I wanted to kind of keep practicing this skill, and I felt like a whole suit of armor would have been difficult, but also a very good learning experience for me. The problem with kind of diving right into your projects without thinking a whole lot is that you kind of get bad results like I did. I realized that the cape was going to be in the way and obscure too much of the armor, making it difficult to paint. And I also realized that the black undercoat was making it very difficult to get a nice smooth finish with the yellow that I needed for my non-metallic metal gold. I was getting a really chalky, dusty look, so I tossed her in an isopropyl bath and went for the restart. One thing I learned about milliput and isopropyl is that isopropyl debonds milliput. So any kind of gap fills that you have, any kind of holes that have milliput in them are probably going to need to get refilled after the isopropyl bath. Another unfortunate thing is that I lost the sword on Excelsy's back down the drain when I was rinsing the miniature off with water. Oops. It's okay. I wasn't going to use the sword anyway. The miniature already screams Lord of the Rings ripoff with the elven style helmet and also the sword that seemingly looks like Narsil on her back. And I didn't want some random human warrior being in possession of Narsil, the sword of the King of Gondor. So I figured I'd want to make her more generic fantasy and maybe scratch build a weapon for her as opposed to one that is so iconic in a different, narrative. The second time I approached Excelsy, I was much more deliberate and much more poised and much more planned. I started by assembling her right arm and cape as a subassembly. This involved long sessions of precariously holding the miniature in place so that I could visualize where it connected on her shoulders by the cape and in the socket of her arm. I really hate how this cape is separated into two pieces, one being held by her right arm and the rest of the cape being its own piece. When I made a subassembly for this one piece, in order to align the arm socket and the cape on the shoulders, I had to resculpt the folds of the cape because they misaligned so much. I needed to hide that kind of ugly detail. After this, I assembled the helmet and her left arm, and when I went to go check the fit on the body, I noticed kind of a heinous gap that needed to be filled. And at this point, I had a decision to make. I could either fill the gap now in such a way that I could remove it for painting as a subassembly, or I could just not worry about it, paint the two pieces, glue and gap fill it later. Due to my novice experience with this scenario, I opted for the former because I was scared with how much the milliput would spread around and get messy and affect the paint job of the two individual pieces. In order to accomplish this, I had to follow a few steps. First, I added a pin for alignment. Second, I applied a type of grease like Vaseline/petroleum jelly to the left arm socket and a blob of milliput to the arm itself. I then press fitted the two together and with a color shaper smoothed out the fill. I then let it sit with the assistance of gravity and dry. Once the milliput was dry, I could remove it from the rest of the model and now had a gap fill that snapped in like a glove. While this seems like a success, I think in the future I will opt for the option of gap filling after painting both of the pieces. And the reason why is because this process was super fussy and it was super messy, and it was really hard to get the arm to stay where it was supposed to stay while the milliput dried. And I can imagine this being even more heinous for pieces that are more complicated. Mine was relatively easy because I could just lay the miniature on its side and it would stay there, but I can imagine needing to use like rubber bands and all these other utensils to get it to stay there. So I think what I'll do is I'll gap fill after painting and maybe just not spend so much time on the area by the gap fill. So if there is a mess, I can just, not worry about ruining time invested in that specific area. I also wanted to give Excelsy a cool base to stand on. I haven't made many display bases, but I absolutely love the idea, and so I really wanted to tackle a cool display base with this miniature. I had the idea of Excelsy standing over a stone bridge over a calm spring, and I kind of liked that idea. I wanted Excelsy to be like kind of a new recruit in the army, and she's wearing shiny gear, it's all nice looking, and she's kind of gazing over maybe her hometown with one last look before she heads like out into battle, that kind of narrative. And so I wanted my display base to also kind of mimic that emotion. I cut a section of 3x3 and got to crafting. I found a twig in my backyard that I could use as a tree. I then bent a 2" by 1" section of plastic card over a form with a heat gun to form the bridge armature. I mounted it on the base with 2 blobs of milliput and then smoothed it out. I then added slate rocks to the bridge. The slate on top of the bridge I created in a special way. I took a piece of grease-proof paper about the size of my piece of plastic card and taped it to the bridge. I then flattened a thin piece of milliput over the bridge and let it cure fully. I could then break the pieces of milliput off and they would form my slates of rock that fit into the pieces like puzzles. This idea that I had was a triumph for me, and I was really happy with how it turned out in the end. One thing that you can also do to make this a little bit easier is you can take the milliput and you can bake it further in the oven. And this will dry it out even more and make it even more brittle. Because if you don't do that, the milliput is still a little bit rubbery when you break it and you don't get the best effect. But oven dry it and then it's brittle and it snaps super good and looks just like a rock. After this, I added various textures. I wanted to use dirt as the grout for the slate rock and sand for the bed of the spring. The dirt granules I used were far too large and almost the exact same size as the sand, so when I primed it, there was no difference between the two. I ignored this at first and moved on to painting the miniature. I started by painting the largest and most difficult part of the miniature for me, which was the non-metallic metal gold part. I painted in 1 to 2 hour sessions, and I tackled either individual plates of armor or just sections of the armor and completed them almost start to finish. And the reason why I do this and why some other painters do this as well is because you get a little bit of feeling of success, a little bit of a dopamine hit when you complete a part of the miniature. And this success feeling helps you to continue on with the miniature. If you paint a project like this where you paint the entire miniature all at the same time, it can be a little bit bogging to not see the final product until the very end after you invested, 200 or more hours in it. I painted a lot of non-metallic metal gold with this mini, and about halfway through I settled on a good process that I'll detail. I started base coating in a 50-50 mixture of Sahara Yellow and Gabi Brown. These are both scale 75 colors. I then added successfully brighter opaque layers by mixing in more and more Tenaire Yellow, also from scale 75. I did a similar process by blocking in the shadows with a mixture of scale 75 black and Gabi Brown. So at this point, I have very, very distinct opaque layers that you can see. I then blended the transitions between these layers with a feathering technique that Gareth Nichols describes quite well in his blog, link in the description below. Once I got my blends to a good point, I added in separation with an almost pure white and pure black thin lines. This helped pinpoint the details and gave it a nice, metallic, high reflection. With just these colors, the non-metallic metal gold looked a little too brown. So I took Dollar & Rowney yellow ink and I glazed the entire armor with it. This helped smooth out the transitions even more, and it also kind of bumped the yellow color a little bit, which is really important when you're trying to seal the deal with a gold look. You need it to look a little bit yellow. And also I took black ink, Citadel black ink, and I glazed that into the shadows to deepen the contrast of the shadows to make it look like it had even more of a highly reflective look. Contrast is super important when trying to employ non-metallic metal, and I tried to bump it even more with these glazes. After the armor was done, I decided to move on to the chainmail on her chest and her arm and kind of in the shoulder of her other arm. Due to my decision to do non-metallic metal gold, I'm also kind of pigeonholed into doing non-metallic metal silver. I've been told by several painters that you shouldn't really mix non-metallic metal and true metallic metals. For most cases, I'm sure there are cases where it's okay, but for most cases you shouldn't, so I decided just to follow their advice. Almost immediately, I reasoned with myself that I would be unable to highlight individual links of chainmail in a realistic fashion. It was simply too difficult for me. So I instead painted it as though it was scale mail with little square scales. I created a grid and then shaded it accordingly. This was much easier to accomplish. The one thing I learned from this, however, was that the areas that were highlighted using a line that was gray as opposed to black or near black created a more realistic non-metallic metal scale mail. If you use a harsh black line, it just stands out way too much and it makes it look way too deliberate and not as realistic. The specific colors I used were a mixture of Vallejo black, Codex gray from Citadel, and Winsor & Newton titanium white. I also used Citadel blue ink to glaze from the midtones into the shadows to make it look more blue. I'm not necessarily sure the exact reason why people always kind of incorporate blues into their non-metallic metal steel. Maybe it makes it look more steely. There are versions of metal that are blued, but most don't necessarily have blue in them. Maybe it's because the sky is blue and some of the blue would reflect in the metal itself. But one thing's for sure is that it makes the piece of the miniature sure look a lot more interesting than if it were just white, gray, and black. With both non-metallic metal items out of the way, that's where we'll stop part 1 of this video series. In future videos, we'll go over casting the head that I used to replace the one that Excelsy comes with, the pants, the cloth on the arm, the cape, scratch building the bow and the quiver that I used, and also remaking the base for Excelsy. If you enjoyed this video where I kind of discuss my thought process while I'm painting a miniature to the best of my ability, I have another video series where I paint a Dark Elder Succubus for an online painting competition that kind of goes into similar detail. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a thumbs up. If you like the channel and want to support it, I have t-shirts and stickers available on my Redbubble account, link in the description below. Subscribe or die, but most importantly, don't forget to paint more minis! Next door neighbor's barking. Probably gonna make my dogs bark. Feels bad, man. Individual pieces.